Hi, I'm Toby.
I'm Satoko.
And I'm Kate. We're the Ceruleo Continuo team. Welcome to episode 7 of Burying the Dead Behind the Scenes.
Today we're talking about playing Continuo and researching and developing the music in Burying the Dead. I play lutes and guitars, and in Burying the Dead I play the theorbo, which is a massive bass lute, which you probably already know by now if you've been watching these videos, and the baroque guitar.
I play viols of different shapes and sizes, and the cello, and in Burying the Dead I play the bass viol.
I play historical keyboard instruments, and in Burying the Dead I play harpsichord.
Continuo are instruments that play normally from the bass line to accompany voices or other instruments, and this can range from a single player to a large continuo group that you might find in Baroque opera, for example.
Yeah, in this era of music, the basso continuo, the bass and the harmony is really important, so that the music is built from the roots. And then harmony is like a pillar, so we are kind of scaffolding of the architecture of the music. Am I right to say that? Do you think? Do you agree?
Yeah, and in this era of music, lots of different instruments could play continuo, including wind instruments, all sorts of other keyboards and plucked instruments. But in what we have in Ceruleo, in the one lute, one keyboard, and one bowed bass instrument, we covered most of the main ones that you would be likely to see in the 17th century. So by no means all of them, but the most common instruments we have.
And sometimes we don't play all the time together, but we swap each other or we change the combination to differentiate the color or texture.
So the continuo instruments play from what we call figured bass. This is where you have just the bass line, and underneath it or sometimes above it you'll have little numbers which indicate what notes to play as well as the note you have in the bass part. So for example, if you had the note C in the bass part, if you had no numbers at all with that, now there are lots of other ways of working out what harmony might happen based on the context in the piece. But if you just had a C and no other clues, you might assume that you play what we would now call a C major chord, so C, E and G. The E and the G are notes 3 and notes 5 above the C, so C, D, E, F, G. So for that reason we call this a 5-3 chord, or in modern sort of musical parlance, a root position chord. And so these chords were so common that you probably wouldn't even have a 5 or a 5-3, because that is what's assumed to be happening if you don't have any sort of figured bass numbers. However, if you wanted to play, for example, notes 6 and 3 above the bass, so above a C that would be an E and an A, so C, E and A, which again in modern sort of musical terminology we would call a first inversion A minor chord, but they didn't necessarily think about it like that in the 17th century, but it might be a useful way to think about it if you're listening to this now. That would be a 6-3 chord, so notes 6 and 3 above the bass note. And this is usually abbreviated to a 6. And I could go along through every type of chord and talk to you about how they're notated, but what's really clever about this system is that any harmony you could possibly imagine can be notated using this system. A bass note and then numbers which indicate what other notes you can play.
So in the Burying the Dead, one of the pieces we perform is Rosie Bowers, the song Purcell wrote at the very end of his life. picked up these few bars from Rosie Bowers. For example, the first chord says sharp. This flowery mark is actually sharp, and I've got a bass note D written by Purcell and given the sharp 3. That means the third note is sharp. And as Toby said, it's a basic to add 5, it's not written. So 5th note is A, so to play D major chord. And next 6.
For the example Satoko gave, you will see in the vocal part as well, the singer has F sharps and A's. So that reinforces what the figured bass is telling us, that these are the notes happening above your D, which is your bass note, so is your fundamental part of the harmony. You see after the sharp 3, there's in that bar a 6. Now, it's written pretty much straight after the sharp 3, but if you look at the vocal part, you'll see that that 6th note, the B, in this case a B flat, because we have flats in the key signature, happens halfway through the bar, or on the 3rd beat of a bar of 4. So that's telling you that you have D major for the first half of the bar, and then you have the introduction of a B flat halfway through the bar, which changes the harmony. Now, exactly how that changes the harmony, this is where we get into more interesting territory, because you have a certain amount of flexibility, and there are different ways of thinking about the harmony in the 17th century, and for us to apply those ways of thinking to the way we play. So against a D major, the B flat would be what a traditionally dissonant note, and you could choose to cancel out that dissonance entirely. So from your D major, if you added B flat, you see that's quite a juicy chord, but it's dissonant. So now that we know that we've got the B flat halfway through the bar, there are a few different ways of realizing that. I'll give you 3 different options. For example, you could add the B flat to your D major chord, which gives you a nice dissonant crunch. You could instead change your F sharp to an F natural, which gives you a B flat major chord, which I would say isn't really appropriate for this bit, but it's one option that someone might come up with. Or you leave your D major chord and allow the singer to place that B flat to be slightly dissonant against it. Now, here's where which instrument you're playing comes into play. Both theorbo and harpsichord, the notes decay a little bit. Some more than others. My notes probably decay a lot quicker than Satoko's. But if Satoko is playing an organ and was holding a D major, it becomes a very different decision as to whether you change the chord or whether you keep the same chord, because now you have sustained notes and you can't allow your notes don't just naturally die. So that what instrument changes a lot the harmonies you might play and the way that you might play those harmonies. Just to add one further level of complexity, so you can see the sort of things we think about, often in this music the composer might not have written the figured bass parts themselves. These were parts that, in fact, this is from a book called Orpheus Britannicus that was published after Henry Purcell had died. It was supervised by his wife as an edition of his music that would make it as widely available as possible. But there's no guarantee that that 6 that we see was written by Henry Purcell, and even if it was written by Henry Purcell, there's no guarantee that he intended a continuo player to actually play it. Often in music of this period, the figured bass notes really just describe what's happening in the other parts, and a well-educated continuo player would be expected to realise accordingly, using their own knowledge of how to realise this music.
Teach me soft melodious songs to move with tender passion. My heart's darling joy.
Now, I've talked about how playing continuo works for chordal instruments. That covers Satoko and I, and how we might manage the decay or sustain of our instruments, and how we might think about chords in that way. But melodic instruments can also play continuo. So that's something Kate can tell you a bit more about.
So I think our role as bowed basses in the Continuo team is to provide a sort of almost melodic vocal bass line, a continuous line throughout the entire piece. Where Toby and Satoko's notes might decay, ours can keep going throughout and provide that real basis for the melody lines for the singers to sing against. As a gamba player in this group, I do sometimes also play melody lines, but that's quite distinct from my role within the Continuo group.
In Ceruleo rehearsal, when we start new pieces, we get together and sight read together, including Emily and Jenni. And as a Continuo team, we all play together for the first time and discuss about set figured bass if we have a disagreement in the chords between me and Toby, or if there is any mistakes in the music, and we discuss first. And then we have kind of different character of the instruments, so we pick up some kind of emotion in the words, discuss with Emily and Jenni, or characters or any counterpoint, and we decide who's going to play where, or all play together.
So as part of that process of putting together a new piece of music, we would obviously try out some of the different combinations we can have with the three of us, and try and find ways for the instruments to characterize different emotions or affects or like rhetorical gestures within the piece of music. There are some sort of more obvious ways of doing that. So lutes and the instruments that I play are generally sort of quieter and softer and can be a bit sort of obscure, and so if you have bits of music that maybe require a less strong and fundamental accompaniment, we might drop it down to just me or Kate and I, and have Satoko come back for a bit that needs a bit of a push or a bit of a kick to it, to reintroduce a harpsichord. But it's also fun to try and find ways to go against those sort of characteristic descriptions of these instruments. I remember a long time ago doing a Baroque opera, and the director was playing from the harpsichord, and it got to it was a really beautiful sort of lamenting ground bass, and he made a real point of saying, right, lutes, you shut up. We're doing this on the harpsichord. No one ever does this. And he played it incredibly beautifully. And I thought that was a good lesson in how actually, harpsichords can play laments and theorbos can play the dancey bits, and as long as we find a convincing way of doing it, we shouldn't get put into these stock categories too much. And I think having the three of us and the different combinations enables us to really experiment with that.
So when we're working with singers, I think it's really important that we are also very text-based. I think it's something we work on very much in Ceruleo as a whole ensemble. It's very much not just the singers and the accompaniment as two very separate things. We're all working on the same text, and we're all basing what we do on the same words. And it means that we can colour certain words. So, for example, if it's suddenly a happy moment, Toby and Satoko might play a major chord to indicate that. We might play a very strident chord if it's suddenly the mood is changing and it's very shocking. Or we might play very smooth lines for the laments. So I think it's just very important that we are as text-based as the singers are. So here are three different ways that you could interpret the same three bars. First of all, you could just have the bass line.
And for harpsichord to be a little bit dramatic, following the word, "For since my love is dead and all my joys are gone."
So on a different instrument and with a slightly different way of expressing that sentiment, you could have something like this.
Since my love is dead, and all
our show Burying the Dead, we chose obviously from the songs and duets and solos for Emily and Jenni to sing, but we also play some instrumental music. We were semi-conscious realizing it, but realizing afterwards the link between those instrumental pieces have a key relationship. The two overtures, so the beginning of first half and beginning of second half of the show, are both D minor. And there's a big moment of a Purcell mourning for the Queen as well as her baby who he lost. We perform Auditory, which is a C minor. And C minor is really key in the whole show. We inserted this C minor instrumental piece in quite a few places. So this tune called Slow Air from The Butcher's Wife comes really few in places. Also, when upbeat moment is, lots of pieces are all G minor somehow. When we have a great fire scene, there are 3 pieces we play in G minor.
The piece Satoko mentioned, Slow Air from The Virtuous Wife, this is one I've never heard before, and it's a really beautiful one actually, so that was great to discover. Some of the other pieces in C minor were instrumental pieces that Kate and I played, I think mainly because we could be a little bit more discreet underneath some text. And those were good examples of pieces that came about really through the rehearsal process. So at one point Tom Guthrie, I think the director, had the idea that you would hear bits from Rosie Bowers, which is Henry Purcell is writing throughout the whole show. And that you would actually sort of see him write it and you would hear this as it happens. So Kate and I played the triple section a bit in 3 time, and that was quite fun because Kate played the melody and I was able to play the bass line in a sort of more melodic way. And the theorbo it's always been quite a good melodic bass instrument, but now tends to just have chordal rolls, so that was quite fun. And then the other one was we needed something sad and quiet and in the key of C minor. And I knew from having done it with a singer before, the Purcell song On a Ground, What a Sad Fate. So I thought, sad, it's in C minor, that'll work. And I think Kate and I really enjoyed playing that one too.
So one of the wonderful things about being a gamba player in Ceruleo is that I get to play some pieces that were not originally written for my instrument. In Burying the Dead, we had a couple of these pieces, and they were arranged very brilliantly by our own Satoko.
So for Overture, I obviously gave a melody line to Kate, and for me to kind of play reduction of other orchestra parts. And I used 2 instruments Toby plays in quite effectively, if I may say. So we start a kind of grand overture section with Theobo's really rich sound of high and low. And then the second section gets a little bit quicker. So while Kate and me are playing a counterpoint of the beginning of the 4 bars of this section, Toby just swap the instruments and have a baroque guitar, which is more percussive, and he start joining our percussive faster section.
One of the challenges of being a musician in this show was getting a bit more involved. I think we've all had this experience of playing in a pit band for like Baroque opera, which has its own challenges, especially if you play the lute and your sound is being aimed into a wall and there's hundreds of people out there and you're hoping they're somehow going to hear you. But in this case, it's obviously a smaller chamber piece and we're on stage and really had to get involved with it more. So Kate and I, for example, with Jenni, went for a walk with our candles, which had numerous challenges. First of all, walking very slowly down a raked stage and some steps. I also had the problem, I don't know if I lost weight, I think probably not, but either way my sort of shorts were quite loose, so I was always worried they were going to show that, so I was sort of awkwardly trying to hitch them up while at the back. I mean, like I said in a previous episode, I think it feels a bit pathetic to complain about these things when the singers were doing all action, dancing, singing, dialogue and everything. But I found that some of that stuff quite difficult.
And hard to remember as well. Hard to remember where the sort of blocking and where we needed to be at any given moment. It's, again, something that would be very simple if it was something you did all the time and if you're very used to being in stage productions. But just a bit of a new experience for us, I think.
And you two had to be in the scene where you had sort of umbrellas running around the bustling city of London. I always felt quite pleased that I had to play right after that, so I got out of that one.
But I was happy that we had the umbrella to hide our faces. I'm sure it was horrible.
It's funny, it was good for me anyway, the rehearsal process, to sort of have time with Tom, the director, because I've always been a bit sceptical about stuff like that and never wanted to do any of that stuff. But we were rehearsing it for long enough that I started to see from his perspective and from an audience perspective how much it could add to the show to have us not just sit there statically all the time. So then you sort of have to accept, right, I have to accept now I'm just going to have to do this and I'll just try and not mess it up.
Also, it helped me during the rehearsals. Tom mentioned that even while we were playing or while we're not playing, just involved with our faces and eyes in the stage, what's going on, and kind of with our eyes telling Purcell to...
I mean, sometimes we were kind of menacing. We were supposed to be sort of bullying him as the figments of his imagination, which obviously for three people as nice as us is very challenging, but we managed it. Our next episode is an interview with our director, Thomas Guthrie.
Please subscribe so that you don't miss out. Thanks for watching.